You're on a journey through the Bible to experience the epic story of God and to learn your part to play in the unfolding drama. Prepare for your role as you learn your history, your enemy, and your king. Welcome to the Bible Brief. Join us today as we review the major themes of the Hebrew Bible. The culmination of the story is imminent, and the themes so far take our expectations to new heights. You're listening to the Bible Brief. The Hebrew Bible is a unified collection of diverse books, illustrating a story that's building to an inflection point. It illustrates the main problems of the Bible, originating in the Garden of Eden through the crafty words of the serpent. And it expands to show God's purpose for the world endures. God is going to bless the whole world, and He's going to do it through a specifically chosen family line. He's going to do it through a seed. Outside of the main core of the story, however, there are several themes that support this central thrust to the story. Themes that communicate methods and principles that will help us understand the story even better. So we're going to drill down on a few of these themes as we consider the whole Hebrew Bible before launching into the New Testament. We're going to focus on four major themes. 1. God's sovereignty. 2. The temple, the priests, and the sacrifices. 3. Faith is the key to righteousness. And 4. The coming seed. So we'll begin with our first major theme, God's sovereignty. Beginning way back on the very first page of the Bible, we saw God create the whole universe, the earth and everything in it. We saw Him create the plants and animals, and we saw His crowning creation of mankind in His image and likeness. After the creation of man, He gave them dominion over the earth. That is, He granted them subordinate sovereignty. With God's blessing, they would rule over the plants, the animals, and the land. In just these first few pages of the Bible, we discover a truth that has profound influence on the rest of the story. God, the creator of the universe, has rights over His creation. He can do what He wants whenever He wants. This is God's sovereignty. His authority and ability to do what He wants, whenever He wants, with all that is His. Throughout the story, we see God exercise His sovereignty, either through granting subordinate sovereignty, or through direct intervention as the ultimate ruler. After the fall of man in the garden and the subsequent generations, we see God flood the earth in judgment on the sin of mankind. We later see Him confuse the languages of the people building the ancient tower in the city of Babylon. But in a more positive development, we see God call Abram, expressing great unconditional promises to him. In what we call the Abrahamic covenant, God promises to Abram the land of Canaan, abundant seed or offspring, and blessing to all the world through one particular seed. After that, we see God continue to choose through whom His promise would be accomplished. It would be through Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. God's sovereignty means that God can do what He wants when He wants, choose what He wants when He wants, and act in history to accomplish His purposes. His purpose is to bless all the nations of the world, and in His sovereignty, He's chosen to do that through a particular family. We get an even closer view of God's sovereignty as He expresses His rule over the nation of Israel. Over 400 years after Abraham, He gives the now populous nation of Israel a law. This law, given by God through Moses, comes with blessings and curses. If followed, God will ensure blessing in the land of Canaan. But if disobeyed, God would ensure cursing and expulsion from the land. God has revealed His rule through a law to Israel. But with the complaining of the people in the wilderness, we see, alongside Moses, that Israel will inevitably disobey the law. Years later, the disobedience continues, where after conquering much of the land through the leadership of Joshua and the judges, the people eventually reject God as king over them. Instead, they demand that human kings rule over them so that they can be like the other nations. God sovereignly decides to give the people what they want. God again grants subordinate sovereignty to the kings of Israel, and eventually grants more promises to King David, the man after God's heart. In what we call the Davidic covenant, God promises to David a dynasty, a throne, and an everlasting kingdom. A promise to be realized through the future seed of David who follows God in righteousness. By the end of the period of the kings and the divided kingdom, however, we see the failure of the human kings of Israel, with David's seed still not being introduced to the story. The people had demanded that human kings be given sovereignty, and God gave them their request. That request, however, ultimately ends in disobedience to the law and expulsion from the land long ago promised to Abraham. Yet, lest the nations think that Israel was exiled from the land because of weakness on God's part, God vindicates his power and his sovereignty by showing the kings of Babylon and Persia that God indeed has dominion and sovereignty over all things and over all rulers. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, says this about God: "His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation." God doesn't want us to miss through the whole Hebrew Bible that despite the disobedience and the misuse of subordinate sovereignty by humans, God still retains total sovereignty over all things. He can choose to do what he wants whenever he wants over his creation. The second theme we'll explore is part of the law that God gave the nation in the wilderness through Moses. The theme of the temple, the sacrifices, and the priests. In the wilderness, God told the Israelites to build a tent for him. It would be the place where God would make his presence known on the earth. It was a tent called the tabernacle that would be the center of worship for the people as they followed God in the wilderness and later entered the land of Canaan. This was the place specifically designed to remind people of the Garden of Eden, showing that God himself was the way back to the garden. Further, as part of worship in this tent, the nation was commanded to do ritual sacrifices throughout the year. They were especially to do sacrifices for atonement covering for their sins, where the death of the animal would be a substitute for their own death. Atonement and substitution were required because, as was announced way back in the Garden of Eden, death is the penalty for sin. The substitute animal would die, and its blood would cover over the sins of the people, so that God would pass over them in judgment for their sins committed since they last made a sacrifice. This sacrificial system that God gave the nation allowed them to draw near to God in relationship and to maintain their end of the covenant that God made with them at Sinai. They were to follow the law, and God would bless them in their obedience. Now, the ones who actually performed the sacrifices had to be from a particular tribe in Israel. Remember, the 12 tribes descended from the 12 sons of Jacob, and the tribe of Levi was the tribe responsible for all these sacrificial functions for the nation. The Levites were responsible for both the tabernacle and later the temple. This temple, these sacrifices, and these priests were central to the religious life and to the covenant-keeping function of the nation of Israel. The temple aided in upholding the covenant and expressed either obedience or disobedience to the law. In fact, showing the eventual utter corruption of the temple and the sacrifices by the end of the time of the kings, God announces through the prophets the destruction of the temple and the expulsion of the people from the land of Canaan. They'd forgotten the law, and in doing so, God removed the temple, the sacrifices, and the priestly duties. Fellowship through these functions was destroyed through disobedience. Only with a new temple could they be resumed. This leads to our third theme. Faith is the key to righteousness. Once humanity fell into corruption in the Garden of Eden, we gained an inevitable inclination to sin. Over and over again through the Bible, we see this inclination manifest in acts of deceit, murder, and violence, and no one in the story is immune from this corruption. Everyone is sinful, and this is the main problem of the Bible. How can sinful humans approach a sinless and holy God? How can we have a close fellowship with our Creator if we consistently sin against Him? How can we defeat the sin that always leads to death? Well, we find the answer first in Genesis 15:6. In the story of Abraham, we find the statement that Abraham believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. Somehow, in exchange for Abraham's faith in God, God grants his perfect righteousness to Abraham. It turns out that when you're irreparably weak, the best thing you can do is believe in the strong to help you. The strong will be your strength. This is what Abraham did. He trusted in God, and God gave him righteousness. Another stark example of this is later with King David. After egregiously sinning against God and his law through coveting, adultery, and murder, David pleads to God with these words, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin." David has a faith-filled response to his own faithless sin. Finally coming to terms with his sin, he asks God to blot it out. He knows that he can't clean himself, and he knows that God is the only one who can make him clean. David's faith isn't in becoming better. His faith is in God, who can make David clean by God's own perfect righteousness. Despite the sin that sentenced us all to death, we see through Abraham, David, and many others that the solution isn't in ourselves, it's in God. Faith is the key to righteousness. The final theme is this: there is a coming seed, the one eventually called the Messiah, the Anointed One. This is one of the most important points of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, in many ways, you could think about the Hebrew Bible as containing only three essential elements: the problem of sin, the results of sin, and the promise of God. And this theme of the coming seed, the coming Messiah, is the absolute center of the third element, the promise of God. Ever since the cursing of the serpent way back in the garden, we've been waiting for this seed. We first find out that he will be a seed of Eve, who will crush the head of the serpent. He will defeat evil once and for all. Later, this seed gets more definition as the seed of Abraham, who will defeat his enemies and bless all the nations of the world. And as if to put an exclamation point on the promise, we learn that he will also be the seed of David, who will rule over the everlasting kingdom on David's throne. Genealogically, we know that this man will be a descendant of Eve, of Abraham, and of David. Descriptively, we know that he will defeat his enemies, bless the world, and rule over the everlasting kingdom. There is, however, one other quality that we know about this coming one. Somehow, he will be God. He will be called God with us, Mighty God, and the Prince of Peace. And yet, he will also be the servant of the Lord, who accomplishes righteousness through his own suffering. By the end of the Hebrew Bible, the expectation of the Messiah is brimming. The Messiah who will be sovereign as God is sovereign. The Messiah who will solve the never-ending sacrifices in the temple. The Messiah who will make righteousness available to the nations through faith. The Messiah who will fix the identity crisis in the very heart of humanity. The Messiah is coming soon. God is about to do the great reversal of human history. He's going to make a virgin bear a child. He's going to make the lame walk, the blind see, and the dead live. Are you ready to meet the Messiah?
For Bible readings, reflection questions, and quizzes, don't miss the Bible Brief app. Available on iOS and Android, so you can go deeper into the story. The Bible Brief is a project of the Bible Literacy Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping you learn the Bible. Give to support the Bible Brief by visiting BibleBrief.org or tap the Give link in the show notes. Thank you for supporting the Bible Literacy Foundation.